I remember the first time I set foot on the property. Emily and I had driven for hours from the city, our route becoming increasingly rural until the road finally turned into a dirt path that led us through dense, encroaching woods. The farmhouse loomed ahead, an old, weather-beaten structure that seemed to shudder in the fading light. I'd been looking forward to this vacation, a chance to unwind and escape the city's chaos. But as we pulled up to the house, a chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Emily's grandparents, John and Martha, were waiting outside, their faces creased into what I assumed were warm smiles. But there was something unsettling about them. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too narrow, and there was a way they looked at me that made me feel like I was an intruder in their world, not just a guest. As we stepped inside, the house seemed to groan under its own weight. The interior was dimly lit, and a peculiar smell, something metallic and a bit rancid, wafted through the air. I tried to dismiss it as a quirk of the old farmhouse, but it clung to my senses and made my skin crawl. Every creak of the wooden floorboards and every whisper of wind against the window panes seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. That night, after a rather stilted dinner, I retired to my room, only to be disturbed by strange noises. There were clattering sounds from the kitchen, followed by hushed, hurried voices that drifted through the walls. I told myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks, but sleep eluded me. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. Emily's grandparents seemed friendly enough, and they were keen to show me around the farm. As we walked the property, I couldn't help but notice how John and Martha seemed overly concerned with their livestock, always checking the animals, whispering to each other in hushed tones when they thought I wasn't looking. It was during one of these inspections that I stumbled upon a small, locked shed behind the barn. John's eyes flitted nervously when I asked about it, and Martha quickly changed the subject. Later, while exploring the basement, I discovered a collection of jars lined up neatly on a shelf. The jars were filled with what I hoped were preserved fruits or vegetables, but as I peered closer, a sickening realization set in. Some of the contents were disturbingly unrecognizable. The disquieting feeling in the pit of my stomach grew stronger with every passing hour. There was something deeply wrong here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was clear that this vacation was becoming anything but relaxing. The unease gnawed at me with each passing hour. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled over me like a shroud, but it only intensified with every odd detail I uncovered. My curiosity, and perhaps a need for reassurance, drove me to investigate further. It started with the sounds again. Late at night, when the house was supposed to be silent, I could hear muffled, eerie noises coming from downstairs. It wasn't just the house settling. It was as if someone, or something, was moving around in the dark, whispering and shuffling. One morning, while John and Martha were busy preparing breakfast, I decided to explore the basement more thoroughly. I had already noticed the locked shed and the strange jars, but now I needed to understand what was really going on. The basement was dimly lit and cramped, with cobwebs hanging in the corners like faded, ghostly curtains. As I rummaged through old boxes and forgotten relics, I stumbled upon a hidden door behind a stack of dusty crates. My heart raced as I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended deeper into the earth. The air grew colder and heavier as I made my way down, my flashlight flickering with every step. At the bottom, I found a room that was anything but ordinary. The walls were lined with shelves holding more jars. These weren't filled with fruits or vegetables. No, these were filled with preserved human organs and other unsettling specimens. Each jar was meticulously labeled with dates and names. My stomach churned as I realized the true nature of these preserved treats. But the horror didn't stop there. Alongside the jars were tools, scalpels, bone saws, and an assortment of other surgical instruments. The realization hit me like a physical blow. John and Martha were not just eccentric. They were cannibals, and this was their grisly collection of trophies. I had to get out. I stumbled back upstairs, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The once welcoming house now felt like a claustrophobic prison, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning. In my frantic state, I tried to find Emily, hoping she could explain or perhaps even help. I found her in the living room, where she was sitting quietly. I confronted her, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. I demanded to know why she had brought me to this nightmarish place. Emily's face went pale as she confessed that she knew about her grandparents' dark secret all along. She told me that she had tried to convince herself that it was part of their family tradition, and that there was nothing she could do about it. Her words felt like a betrayal, an unbearable weight that made it hard to breathe. The person I had trusted most had knowingly led me into this nightmare. In a panic, I reached for my phone, determined to call the police. But as I dialed, Emily's face took on a look of horror and desperation. She warned me that the police in this town were not to be trusted. Her grandparents had connections, she said, and the authorities were likely part of their sinister web. I felt my world spinning out of control. My only chance was to find a way out before it was too late. My heart was racing as I burst into the living room, where Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor. I felt like a cornered animal, desperate to escape, but first, I had to confront her. I gripped her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Emily, you have to tell me what's going on," I demanded, my voice breaking. "Why did you bring me here? Your grandparents, they're monsters." Her eyes widened, and she looked up at me with a face that seemed to drain of color. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew," she stammered, her eyes filled with tears. "I knew about them. I knew what they do. It's part of our family's tradition. They've always done it, and I convinced myself it was necessary, that it was a part of who they are." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I staggered backward, my mind struggling to process the weight of her confession. The woman I had trusted, the person I thought I knew so well, had knowingly led me into this nightmare. The betrayal was like a physical blow, and I felt sick to my stomach. No, this can't be real," I said, more to myself than to her. "You have to help me. I need to call the police." I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. Emily's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Don't," she said urgently. "The police, they're involved too. My grandparents have connections. The authorities here are compromised. They won't help us. They might even be part of it." Her words were like ice water on my face. I could feel the walls of the room closing in on me, the reality of our situation crashing down with brutal force. The terror I felt was compounded by the realization that even the people who were supposed to protect us were in on the horror. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to escape, but how could I trust anyone? The farmhouse suddenly felt like a twisted maze, every door and window a potential trap. I had to find a way out, and I had to do it fast. But first, I had to overcome the crushing weight of betrayal that Emily's confession had left in its wake. My mind raced as I dialed 911, the urgency in my voice barely contained. I tried to explain the situation, how Emily's grandparents were involved in something horrific and that I needed immediate help. As I spoke, the fear and desperation in my voice must have been palpable because the dispatcher assured me help was on the way. The minutes felt like hours as I paced the living room, my eyes darting to the windows and every creak of the old house making me flinch. Finally, headlights pierced the darkness, and the sound of police sirens cut through the night. Relief washed over me as I saw the squad cars pull up, the officers stepping out and making their way to the farmhouse. I met them at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I practically dragged them inside, desperate to show them the evidence and explain everything I had discovered. I led them to the basement, where the jars and tools still lay in plain view. But as the officers began their investigation, a cold realization set in. Their behavior was unnervingly calm. They spoke in hushed tones with John and Martha, their demeanor oddly polite, almost as if they were in on some dark secret. They didn't react with shock or disgust. Instead, they seemed to be in perfect sync with the grandparents. I watched in horror as the officers subtly assisted John and Martha. They helped conceal the more damning evidence, moving jars and tools out of sight with practiced ease. The normal procedures I'd expected from the police, searching for evidence, questioning suspects, never happened. Instead, they worked seamlessly with the grandparents, their actions betraying a deep complicity. The officers' casual acceptance of the situation, their indifference to the grotesque discoveries in the basement, was chilling. I could see it in their eyes, the way they exchanged knowing glances with John and Martha. The horrifying truth began to dawn on me. The police weren't here to help, they were part of the network. The whole town seemed to be entangled in this macabre conspiracy. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Trapped in the farmhouse with no one to turn to, I realized my situation was even more dire than I had imagined. The law enforcement that should have been my saviors were, in fact, enablers of the terror I had stumbled into. My last shred of hope evaporated as I watched the officers and the grandparents move together with eerie harmony. With no one left to trust and no way to get help, I knew I had to find another way out. My mind raced, desperate for a plan, as I struggled to hold back the rising tide of despair. As the realization sank in that the police were in on the horror, I felt a surge of panic unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I had to get out, and fast. With no other options and time running out, I knew I had to act quickly. I darted to the barn, my mind racing through every possible escape route. In the dim light of the moon, I found an old, rusted car tucked away in the corner. The vehicle looked like it hadn't been driven in years, but it was my only chance. I fumbled with the keys I found in a drawer and managed to start the car with a grinding roar. The engine sputtered and choked, but it came to life. I slammed the car into gear and tore down the winding dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The wind howled through the cracked windows as I drove, the sensation of freedom mingling with a deep, gnawing fear. The road was treacherous, winding through the dense woods that seemed to close in around me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but my relief was short-lived. From the corners of my vision, I began to hear whispers and footsteps echoing in the night. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until I was certain that John, Martha, and their accomplices were chasing me. A sharp, jolting thud interrupted the deafening roar of the engine, and the car began to sputter and lose power. Panic surged as the engine coughed and died, the vehicle coming to a shuddering halt in the middle of the road. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that I had no choice but to flee on foot. I stumbled out of the car and plunged into the woods, the dark trees and underbrush clawing at me as I ran. The forest was dense and disorienting, and the haunting sounds of my pursuers seemed to follow me, echoing through the trees. Branches whipped against my face, and the ground beneath my feet was uneven and treacherous. Every step felt like a struggle against the encroaching terror. I could hear the faint, distant sounds of voices and footsteps behind me, the knowledge that I was being hunted lending an almost physical weight to my fear. I darted through the underbrush, hoping against hope that I could find some kind of sanctuary. Eventually, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The sounds of my pursuers grew fainter, but I knew they wouldn't stop searching. I had narrowly escaped, but the forest was not a safe refuge. It was just another part of the nightmare. The oppressive darkness surrounded me, and as I tried to calm my racing heart, I was left with the haunting realization that I was alone, lost in the forest, with the chilling possibility that I might never truly escape the terror that had ensnared me. The distant, echoing sounds of pursuit remained, a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beyond my sight, leaving my fate uncertain and shrouded in dread.